Hey, this is Dave of FFDraftPrep.com. Right now we're going to be looking at the 2017 Research Tool. We've put this tool out for a number of years now. Our users seem to really like it. So we've continued to put out and we've expanded some of the data that's included this year. So let's just real quickly at a high level explain what this tool is all about. The purpose is to help you efficiently do player evaluation as you prepare for the 2017 season. It focuses on summarizing player information from the last 5 seasons in a manner that allows you to quickly digest how a player has performed, and then you take that past performance and you incorporate that in with changes in that player's situation for the current year, your estimates on their career progression, and you kind of bake all of this into developing a range of outcomes for the coming year. As you can see, we've included 4 positions. There's quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end in the tool. For each position, there's 3 separate screens. So you have your first tab, which is going to outline a particular player. In this case, we're looking at Antonio Brown. You can see that we have a whole plethora of information, which we'll run through in a minute. Then we have a comparison tab where you can compare 2 players at the same position. And finally, we have this summary tab, which is kind of pulling together some of the key data points that you might be interested in looking at for every player with ADP that's relevant at this point, or that we expect to become relevant by draft time. And you can do a lot of different things in here. You can sort these tables and do some different analysis that way. So why don't we start by running through Antonio Brown and breaking down what information you're going to find in the tool. The first thing that you'll notice is in the upper left-hand corner, you can toggle back between standard and PPR scoring. There's a little bit of a lag based upon this recording software, but it should function pretty quickly for you. The only thing to note here is that for quarterback, you'll notice that there is PPR versus standard in this dropdown. For quarterback, the only thing that's going to change is the values in the ADP columns. Scoring is the same for quarterbacks in both of those scoring systems, so only ADP is going to be affected. So let's pop back over to Antonio Brown. We'll stick with PPR scoring. Up at the top, you can see that our FFDP tier, which we spent a lot of time setting these, is populated as well as the player's average ADP from the variety of sources that we include in our draft tool. These 2 pieces of information will update and they'll pull from our database every time that you open the tool. So if we make any updates, those will be reflected up here. This utility metric we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. But you can see for each player, you're going to get their position, their current team, age, height, and weight. Then we drop down to this fantasy summary, which is going to outline the games they've played each season, give you a comparison of where they were drafted overall, where they were drafted at their position, how they finished, the variance between those two, and it's also going to show you their fantasy points. For each position, it's going to show you the number of weeks that they were a starter at that position. We make the assumption that in most leagues, 3 wide receivers are starting. So you can see in 2016, Antonio Brown was drafted first overall on average, first wide receiver, finished ranked wide receiver 1, put up 307 fantasy points, and spent 12 weeks in the top 36. We have an average in this column. If we pop over to this graph to the right, this is breaking down the players' fantasy points by season with their total fantasy points in the bars. Below, you can see a count of the number of games that they played, and their season-ending rank is indicated by this line. So clearly, Antonio Brown has just been phenomenal. Make our way down, you can see that we have per game averages built in here in this graph for the last 5 seasons. And then this little table right here, this is one of my favorite things to look at for every position. What it's doing is it's counting for each of these 5 seasons, the number of times in which that particular player went for 10 or more points, 15 or more points, 20 or more points, 25 plus points. It's also going to look at the number of weeks that they finished in the top 12 or the top 24 at their position. With fantasy football being a weekly game, I think it's easy to get caught up in just looking at season-ending stats or even points per game, but sometimes that's not telling you the whole story about how good or bad or how useful a player has been to own. So if we look at 2015, you can see that Antonio Brown played 16 games, went over 10 points 13 times, went over 25.7 times. He spent 8 out of 16 weeks in the top 12 at the wide receiver position and 11 at the top 24 in the wide receiver position. In this row below, what we're doing is we're taking for 2014 to 2016 the number of games that a player has played, using that as a denominator, and that is being divided by the number of times that they finished over each threshold to come up with this percentage, and then we're normalizing by multiplying that by 16 to get an estimate for the last 3 seasons of if this player had played a full season, how many times would they have finished within each of these thresholds. This analyzing this table and comparing players is going to yield some interesting results that might cause you to change your opinion on how you view a player, particularly in how useful that player might be. So we have career stats over the last 5 seasons. These are your typical things: targets, receptions, yards, touchdowns, broken down. In this table, position rank at the end of the season. This is going to show their PPR points per game, what have you. I like to look at game logs too when reviewing a player, see if there was any trends that you could identify. Perhaps for some players, you know that another receiver on their team was out the first half of the season. You can see how they performed during that period of time. You can real quickly just go back and forth between different seasons. The game log will update nicely, and then you can scroll down and see a breakdown of their standard and their PPR points over the course of the season, visually broken out. So it's easy to digest the ebb and flow of their scoring that way. And then this section here is something new that we included this year. What this section is doing is it's looking at the player that you're researching. It's looking at their average over the last 3 seasons and comparing that with the average player at the position, broken down to looking at players that have actually had, enough usage that it made sense to include them. I forget where I cut it off for receivers, but it might have been something like 30 targets a season. Then it's looking at the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile, so you can see how well this player has performed in relation to his peers. And also for things like points per target, metrics that aren't sticky, you can see if they may have had an outlier of a season and be due for regression. So you can see Antonio Brown is well beyond the 75th percentile, but you'd probably also want to go up and look and see what his points per target have looked like over the last couple of seasons. So you can see that he's generally floating in a very high range. So he's probably one of those guys that is an outlier every season, and you don't need to call that in question. In contrary, though, if you looked up a player like Taylor Gabriel, you'd realize that he saw a huge spike in PPT in 2016. And if you come down to this table again, you'll see that he's really off the charts with that amount from last season, as the 75th percentile is 1.84. Let's go back to Antonio Brown. To switch players, all you got to do is start typing their name. Once it auto-populates, you can click enter, and the player will be pulled into the interface. So we're breaking down, again, the player's average versus some other league-wide numbers. We have these graphs here, which, depending on the position you're looking at, is going to show you the percentile that they fall into, as well as their rank within that position. This table is going to take players that have similar point per game averages over the last couple of seasons, and it's going to show you the percentage of weeks in the top 12, top 24, the FFDraftPrep tier, as well as that player's ADP. So you can kind of get a sense of players that are being drafted around them and see if any players stand out as being differentiated from the rest of the cohort. The other graph here is going to show you the percentile for points per game, top 12 finishes, top 24, and again, positional ranks right here. One thing that I did want to point out was you got to keep in mind when you're looking at these averages from 2014 to 2016, players that have not accumulated 3 seasons might be weighed down by their rookie season, in which they didn't really get into action until the second half of the season. So a player like David Johnson would be a good example of that. Finally, this utility metric, what it's looking to do was I wanted to come up with a way to quickly summarize in just one number how useful a player has been to his owners over the last 3 seasons. So in this notes tab, you'll be able to read through. I kind of break it down, and I break down some of the things included in here in more detail. But essentially, all you need to know is what it's doing is it's looking at the player's points per game. It's a formula that basically adds the player's points per game plus the percentage of weeks they finish in the top 12 plus the percentage of weeks in the top 24 times 1/2 in the case of receivers times top 36 finishes, the percentage of those weeks times 1/4. It's adding those up, dividing by what I would assume would be the optimal amount that a player could accrue for that, normalizing on a scale of 100, and giving you a reference point of how useful this player was in comparison to other players at his position during that time frame. It's kind of a lot to take in right there, but it's broken out in the file. So if we go over to a player comparison, what you can do is you can line up 2 receivers. Here we have Antonio Brown and Jordy Nelson, and you can see their fantasy summary side by side, as well as their adjusted average weeks with X points. So this is something that I always like to look at to see if there's any players that fall out of what I would have expected or that don't really seem to line up with other players that you view as having had similar value. So you can compare their points per game over the last 3 season point totals. And then this is pretty cool. Here in this graph, you can toggle back and forth between different thresholds. So maybe you're trying to find guys that can put up some monster weeks for you. Or maybe you're looking for guys that have had a pretty decent floor. With players like Nelson and Brown, they're pretty much good at everything, so that's not the best example, but you get the idea. And then finally, we have the summary tabs, which, depending on the position, is going to pull in different stats. You can use these scroll bars to navigate back and forth, but it's going to show you their raw average in these stats, and then it's going to show you their rank. And it's also going to have that utility metric that I just talked about broken out only for the 2016 season. So you can sort, you can filter in these tables. You can use this column here to do a comparison. So if we wanted to compare a couple of receivers, we could come into here. We could put X's next to the guys that we want, unselect blanks, go like that, and now we can quickly compare Doug Baldwin, Allen Robinson, DeAndre Hopkins. We can look at their averages for the last 3 seasons, their ranks in comparison to other receivers in that 2016 utility metric. So we have this built for all 4 of the positions, and essentially this is a tool that you can use to just do some very efficient research, dig down deeper into some of these players, and use it to develop expectations for the coming season and build a range of outcomes, which is a really useful thing to do to acquaint yourself with these players. You don't want to just look at projections or just look at rankings. You want to get an idea of the possible outcomes that this player could have, looking at a low scenario, a mid scenario, and a high scenario. And that's really going to help you to understand how we set our tiers and how you can tweak them to your preferences if you are going to be using the draft tool that we're putting out this year, which is free of charge, which is pretty sweet. So definitely check that out. And if you do want to help support the site and what we're doing, via your experience with that tool purchasing, this would be a really great way to help out. I have to put this out as a sold item for 2 reasons. One, contractually with the stat packages that I buy, I can't disseminate it for free. And then I'm also using it to offset the costs of everything else that goes into putting out the draft tool. So anyways, if you have any questions, shoot an email to ffdraftprep@gmail.com. And I really hope that you enjoy this tool and using it to get ready for the 2017 season. All right, thanks for checking it out.